When I talk to students, I always start off with this joke. A graduate student comes to his professor and says, "Professor, how will I get on in life?" And the professor says, "Very easy, my boy, just jump at every opportunity." The student says, "But how will I recognize opportunity?" The professor says, "You won't, just keep jumping." And that is the story of my life. I've jumped at every opportunity. At 88 years of age, I'm still jumping. I was born in a little industrial town in South Africa, Germiston. And one of my earliest memories is actually lying in a crib, looking up at a ceiling, and there used to be pressed steel ceilings, squares with very intricate patterns inside. And I think this was one of the bases of my interest in pattern, repetition, module, complexity within simplicity. I was very fortunate to go to a very ordinary school with a very basic curriculum, where we learned the 3 R's, the reading, writing, and arithmetic, and we got through those within about the first 3 months. I think the teachers, for their own sanity, had to teach us something. So at the age of 6, we were learning about Greek mythology. We were sweeping across Asia with Alexander the Great. We were having a classical education, but we didn't know it. I couldn't think of a better education as a basis for the rest of my life. South Africa was a very tough place. I'm Jewish, and it was a very tough place to be Jewish because we used to be caught every day, abused and beaten up. But as I said earlier, nothing is ever lost in life. At the age of 12, we took a decision, no more beatings up. We're going to go to gymnasium, learn boxing, wrestling, karate, all the martial arts. By the time we were 15, we used to beat up the guys who bullied us. So I learned a lesson: if you don't stand up for yourself, nobody else would. I was very lucky to go to Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg. I hadn't intended to be an architect. I wanted to be a commercial artist. And one of my great passions were steam trains. It was the heroic age of steam. And I could draw railway engines with my eyes closed. When I went along after I left school to get a job as a commercial artist, the work was good enough, it was all right. When they came to the railway engines, they said, "These are obviously copied." And I said, "No, they're original." They would then 3 times in the one day, they closed the portfolio and said, "I would have taken you on, but I will not take on a liar." And I went back home in tears. "Nobody will give me a job, Ma, they won't believe me." Well, we'll have to call. I was an orphan at the stage, and she called in the uncles. And they all said, "Issy likes drawing, he'll be an architect." With me saying, no, I don't want to be an architect. But off to university I went, and again it was the most fortuitous, wonderful experience, because it was not merely architecture. It was being in contact with literature, music, art, everything. I almost didn't make it in my final year because I was so interested in everything, including politics. The politics I'll come to presently. I had an opportunity at the age of 18. I met a man, a choreographer, who said, "I need a stage manager for my ballet company. You seem to be fairly responsible, you're it." And he pointed to me. I'd never even done amateur dramatics. And at the age of 19, I found myself in charge of the biggest theatre in Johannesburg, His Majesty, the biggest theatre in South Africa. Stage managing, which led to my doing sets and costumes, and finally being engaged by a great magician and illusionist called the Great Lyle and his Cavalcade of Mystery. And I toured with him for about 6 months throughout South Africa and Rhodesia. And that knocked the glamour of theatre life out of me. Because every night at the same time, doing the same thing, night after night after night, grew boring. And the girls weren't as pretty as they were at the beginning. And I went back to architecture and graduated. My thesis was on open-air theatres, so the theatre experience had done me a lot of good as well. I was then lucky enough to get a job with a big firm of architects, met the junior partner, and eventually we went into partnership, Crofton and Benjamin. And we did a number of seminal buildings in Durban. Now, the first building that we did between the two of us was a big luxury hotel. And I said to my then wife, as soon as this is finished, we're going to make our first trip overseas. We're not going to wait till we're 70 and do a package trip. We're going to do it now. All the experienced architects said, you're crazy, you're at the beginning of a career. Settle in and consolidate. And I said, no, we're going. And again, that was one of those happy accidents. Because while we were living on the island of Ibiza, which was a simple island in those days, not the hellhole that it is today, I got a letter from my partner saying, there's a big block of flats that needs designing, and they say it's too big and important for a local architect. They want an overseas architect. Now, you're overseas, and they want you to design it. So on a kitchen table in Ibiza, overlooking the Mediterranean, I designed a beautiful curved building with unusual shapes and unusual volumes. There were no photocopy machines. I rolled up that one drawing that existed in the world and with my heart in my mouth posted it. It arrived, they opened it and loved it. And I came back, and that was the real firm basis for the rest of my career. The politics was a different proposition. I was a member of a group that were even left of Trotsky. I suppose we'd be called anarchists today. And we placed ourselves at the disposal of the Black liberation movements. There was no ego there. We didn't try to direct. We said the people know best and we follow what they want to do. In 1953, I had the opportunity to come to England to study ice rinks. Clients sent me. And they said, take this letter to the big guru in England, and the group in England. That letter, the thrust of that letter was, we fear the rise of Zulu chauvinism, that if the Zulus were going to be triumphal over the Xhosas and over the Pondos, it would split the liberation movement, the black liberation. I carried the letter through, and in a small room in Chiswick, third floor room in Chiswick, met the great guru on his way through to America. He opened the letter and said, this isn't the rise of Zulu chauvinism, this is the birth of black consciousness. The phrase had never been used, 1953. 10 white intellectuals sat down and wrote something called the Pan-African Manifesto, one of those 50s documents, exploitation, colonialism, robbing resources, etc., etc. You know, the usual 50s left-wing rhetoric. Good document. I took it back to South Africa. Now, how do you get a dangerous document past the customs people? What I did was I gave them a bait. I put a novel on top of my clothes in the suitcase called Kiss Kiss. And as soon as they opened your suitcase, look at this, it's pornography, man, pornography. You stand here, take it to the chief. And half an hour later, they came back shaking their heads sadly and saying, "Ah, man, it's not pornography, it's just a book. All right, close your case and go." They never even searched for the dangerous stuff that I'd sort of shuffled around. I then got to Johannesburg, passed it on to Ethan Meyer-Seller, who passed it on to Potlako Lobalo, who passed it on to Robert Sobukwe. And in 1953, the Pan-African Congress movement was born. What has happened in South Africa subsequently is white participation is being wiped out of the historical records. And the ANC Youth League claimed that they wrote that document in 1959. I'm busy trying to write my memoirs to rectify the balance. And all those heroic white people who laid their liberty, if not their lives, on the line, are just being discounted. Anyhow, in 1964, somebody who worked for the police surgeon, came to see my two boys, and he was very upset. He'd lost two elderly patients. I said, "Sit down, have a whiskey," and whiskey loosened him up a bit. And he said those classic words to me that changed my life. "Benjamin, I'm going to say something just once, and if you repeat it in a court of law, I'll deny ever having said it. But I'm telling you, man, get out. They're watching you." And when somebody in the police tells you to get out, they're watching you, you get out. And again, exile actually turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life, because it's one thing to be a good architect in South Africa, it's another thing to be in Europe and have access to a worldwide market. And subsequently, I've worked in 16 different countries, designed for about 22 different countries, and my whole life opened up. Although I arrived in 1966 with 2 suitcases, no money, 2 children, ex-wife, current lady, and started my life all over again. Now, I recommend it to everybody. Again, one of those fortuitous things was I was working for an architect friend of mine, and the banks were beginning in 1966-67 to invest in Europe, in Spain and Portugal. And word got round that Ted Levy has an architect who speaks Spanish. The years in Ibiza not only gave them the second big building in South Africa, also laid the basis for my life in Europe. And with my knowledge of Spanish, I was sent out to Spain, Portugal. I picked up Portuguese on the way, Cyprus, Malta, all over the Mediterranean, and never looked back. Designed in Ireland, Japan, Pakistan, Libya, all the Mediterranean islands, Spain, Portugal, Italy. Even have a hotel in Denmark. Took a 300-year-old warehouse and converted it to the Admiral Hotel. It's an award winner, I gather. I never collected any of the awards because the associate architects would get them, but never mind. As a young architect, before I went into partnership with Derek Crofton, I designed a couple of houses, and one of the houses I designed was for my brother. After he'd lived in it for a year, I said, "Liney, what's it like living in this house?" And he said, "It's like being on holiday." And I started to analyze what made that house like a holiday. It was more than a house, it was a home. And many years later, in England, in 1985, I was asked by colleagues to become the architectural advisor to a project called Home of the Future. My first contribution was I changed it from House of the Future to Home of the Future. It was a brainstorming exercise with about 20 of the multinationals, from Lever Brothers to Diamond Square, Square Diamond, Courtaulds, all sorts of people, Ideal Standard. And it was about the 3 years most creative in my life, brainstorming. One of the things, when I spoke to them about my brother's house was a home, was like being on holiday. If you can have home like a holiday, why not work like a holiday? And if you've got work like a holiday, why not life like a holiday? Now you can, because I was brainstorming, I was working with some very intelligent people, and one of the facilitators was a man called John Frank, who knew Alistair. And John Frank and I sort of really established a rapport. And about a year and a half into the project, when one of the left-brain scientists, puffing on his pipe, said, "I do declare, Home of the Future is leading us into a spiritual path." And our eyes met briefly, and we knew this had worked. It was no longer a product search, it was a spiritual quest for quality of life. Back in 1987, as a South African architect, I was invited by the students, National Organization of Students, who were having an architectural students' big convention in Durban. Would I come and be one of the keynote speakers? I thought long and hard about it, and I thought there was an academic boycott going on at the time, when foreigners were just chased out of South Africa. But I decided my credentials were good enough to actually go. I'd been sent into exile, I was coming back. Now, luckily, there was a Jewish holiday on the Monday and Tuesday. I was keynote speaker on the Wednesday. So when I arrived on Wednesday, the student demonstrations for Monday and Tuesday, get out, foreign lecturer, academic boycott, the steam had gone out of it. And I gave my talk. And in the middle of it, I found myself saying, now, if I was one of you young architects, I'd go into the townships, I'd find out what people really... And I looked at that pointing finger and said, my sons have always taught me, once the one finger is pointing, there are 3 pointing back. I threw away my notes and I said, I make my commitment to keep coming back to this country to do whatever I can as an architect or in whatever other capacity. And the aftermath of it was when I got back to England, I was tackled by all the exiled South Africans. You broke the academic boycott, you broke the academic boycott. I said so. I had a very nice, gentle English lady friend at the moment, and she suddenly went berserk. And the finger at them, you've never had an original thought in your life. You don't dare talk to him like that. You wouldn't have the courage to go back to, etc., etc. And they backed off, saying the woman's mad. You wait till Oliver hears about this. Oliver Tambo, leader of the ANC in exile in Sweden. She was so embarrassed and so ashamed. I said, let's just see what the aftermath is. They must have gone to tell Oliver Tambo, Issy Benjamin broke the academic boycott, because the word came back. Certain selected lecturers should be encouraged to go to South Africa, and we are changing the slogan from liberation before education to education before liberation. Stop burning down the schools. When I was working with the Home of the Future project, I met a number of very, very interesting people, not only participants, but the people who were running the whole process. And I became very interested in sacred architecture. Now, sacred architecture, not merely in proportions and the golden mean, etc., but the uses to which sacred architecture was put. Because, during wartime, churches are turned into arsenals, stables, all sorts of things throughout history. So it's very easy to deconsecrate a building, but it takes participation of dedicated people to maintain its sacred properties. Now, one of the things that I learnt was that all cathedrals, all churches are based on the human body, the four worlds. You get the world of intellect in the head, which is the Holy of Holies. You get the world of the heart inside the two arms and the shoulder blades, which is the sanctuary. You get the spine, which links them, which is the inner courtyard, and you get the pelvis and the two legs, which again are the outer courtyard, the entrance. And when you study, every sacred building, whatever denomination it is, will contain those four elements: the outside courtyard, the inner courtyard, the sanctuary, and the Holy of Holies. And it's all based on the human measure. In design, I work freehand. I've never designed with a computer, and I don't ever intend designing with a computer. I like the feeling of the hand flowing and moving, the movement of thinking with the heart. Heartitecture, I think Alistair once called it. And it has never let me down. There was one instance when I was called out to Dublin to design a very big project. Old clients of mine. It was a huge site at Herbert Park, an old factory. You couldn't see the whole site at all. You just moved from room to room. And I couldn't get an idea of what it was all about. We went back to their office. They put a survey drawing down and a piece of tracing paper, and 7 pairs of expectant eyes were watching me, and nothing came. I offered up a little prayer. Please, God, by this time tomorrow I will have done something brilliant. Please show me now. And at that instant, I took a child's wax crayon, made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strokes, and the whole scheme was there. Curved apartment blocks, a hotel, and a V-shaped office block with an atrium down the middle. And it was a sacred moment. I didn't tell them I'd offered a little prayer, but when I saw off paper, their publicity brochure had that diagram. They recognized it as a sacred diagram. The architects, collaborative architects, did all the computer work to get it built, but it's standing today, and I gather won a town planning award. So sacred architecture is not only the result, it's also the method of working. If Alistair gives me a difficult project, I probably will say, I'll tell you tomorrow, because I need sleep and dream time. And in sleep, so many ideas have come. I keep a notebook at my bedside. I can actually draw in the dark, and I scribble down the ideas that come through, and I've never been let down, ever. So sacred architecture is possibly a sacred life. In 1963, through a number of jokey letters with my brother who was working in Nairobi, somehow we found ourselves in the position of being committed to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And on the 22nd of June 1963, the shortest day of the year, I found myself standing on the highest point of Africa. Many years later, I asked a spiritual teacher, what was I doing on the highest point of Africa before I left? And he said, don't you realize you'd gone as high as you could go in Africa? It was time to leave. It was a sign. You didn't take it, so you needed the impetus of get out. During that trip, a black friend of mine from South Africa who was lecturing at Kivukoni College in Dar es Salaam asked me to talk to his students. He had 150 students from all over Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, Mali, everywhere. He said, I want to give them a lesson in racial stereotypes. I'm going to put you on the platform, say this is a South African, and walk out. And I was young enough to agree to do this. I'm faced with such hostility. You murderer, you white murderer, etc., etc. I let it calm down. They said, well, if you haven't killed black people, what good have you done for the black people of South Africa? And I looked around 150 faces and said, I'm not going to tell you anything about myself because I don't know which of you are the police spies. Police spies? I said, if there are 15 of you from Nigeria, at least 3 of you are reporting back on the others. 10 of you from Ghana, at least 2 of you are reporting back to the government, and so on. It's the old divide and rule. They began, police spy, him. Anyhow, we got down to reasonable discourse, and at the end, I got the question I was waiting for. Tall, 7-foot-tall Maasai stood up, said, do you believe all men are born equal? And I said, no, I believe all men are born different. You're tall, I'm short. I respect your height, you respect my height. We're all born different and we respect each other's differences. There was a stunned silence, and suddenly they got the lesson. We are not ciphers. As I tell students these days, at the end of a talk, I'm going to let you into a little secret. We are not human beings struggling towards the divine. We are divine beings struggling to be human.